Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. This is the Visualizing California Philanthropy program, so I hope you're all in the right room and all on the right web stream. Welcome to those of you who are viewing us live on the internet. My name is Ellen LaPointe. I am the President and CEO of Northern California Grantmakers, and we are delighted to be here today with you in support of this very, very important conversation that we're going to have. I want to begin by thanking the James Irvine Foundation for very, very generous support of this project overall. To give you just a bit of context, there'll be a lot of that coming in the next couple of hours, but between 2012 and 2015, we know that funders in California shared detailed information and data on over 73,000 grants, totaling about $5 billion in giving to 22,000 independent recipients. So it's a ton of information, and it's just a fraction of actually what happened. Imagine if we could really see what this looked like sort of full on, if there were 100% patient in this project, so we could really see the full spectrum of giving. Imagine if you could really understand sort of the full significance of the investment in health services throughout the state of California. If you could understand to what degree a particular community is or is not receiving philanthropic resources to support particular challenges. Imagine if you could ask almost any question you could think of and turn to reliable, complete data to inform your decision-making and process. Imagine use this as a means to collaborate organically because it's really going to, I think, as we'll see when we talk today, give us a lot of opportunities to consider how we might come together differently, knowing more than we ever have before. Going to drive us today, that's our conversation. And NCG is delighted to be part of this. We are among 20 regional associations who are very, very deeply invested in the success of this project. And again, really happy to be working with our counterparts here in California. We have a shout out. I think San Diego Grantmakers is here with us on the web or on the internet. So welcome to all of you. Again, I think our regional association interest is really to foster good conversation and good collaboration whenever possible in service to our impact goals. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Brad Smith, and he'll lead us through the discussion with this panel, and he'll introduce your panelists one by one. But first, I want to encourage all of you who are here in the room and also online to be jotting down questions. Think about, as this conversation unfolds, what's sparking your interest, what questions or concerns might be coming up as you hear the discussion. If you are participating online, you will see, I'm going to have to read this, you can see directly to the right of the YouTube video, if that's how you're tuning in, you'll see a chat window, and you're invited to type questions in on that side, and someone on this side will be monitoring that and bringing them to the group. You can also ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag MAP4GOOD, that's MAP number 4 GOOD. So how about that for being in the new era? Housekeeping to begin with, just a little more. The bathrooms are sort of in the hallway right behind this room. We want to invite you not to exit through all of those enticing doors back there, but to actually go out to the right so that the web stream is maintained at all times above that door back there, and we want to make sure that the visuals are uninterrupted. We have internet access information on each of your tables if you want to be on Wi-Fi and streaming or checking information as you go. We've been asked to remind you that composting is the order here at the World Affairs Council, the green bins. Just about everything except that which you are drinking can be put in that bin. And then lastly, but not least, of course, if you have time at the end of this program and can run upstairs to the you're always invited and welcome to take a look at the resources at the Foundation Center. They have an enormous wealth of resources for all of us, and would love to host you and say hello. Davis Parchment from the Foundation Center has asked me to tell you that she will be hosting a webinar, right, that you can learn more about on the NCG website, ncg.org. That's going to be a deeper dive into the hows of all this. We're not going to talk about the mechanics of the database today at all, but that webinar will be sort of a next steps piece to this if you are motivated to learn how you can actually begin to work with it directly, day to day. So with that said, is everybody in the right room, first of all? Okay. I'm going to introduce you to Brad Smith. Absolutely extraordinary man. I've been reading about his background. President of the Foundation Center, and has essentially spent his entire career in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. Brad has been with the Foundation Center in this capacity since 2008, and before was president of the Oak Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland, which is a family foundation that had programs and grant activity in 41 countries around the globe. And prior to that, he was 10 years VP of the Global Peace and Social Justice Program at the Ford Foundation, which provided hundreds of millions of dollars to organizations that were working on human rights and international cooperation and governance issues globally. He is currently on the board of directors of the Tinker Foundation and the advisory board of the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security. And I asked him to tell me one thing that we might not know about him. And he said that he wants you to know he has a degree in ethnomusicology, which I hope he'll talk a little bit about, maybe on a break or something. So this guy knows his stuff. Perfect panel. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to Brad.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. First of all, the degree in ethnomusicology is proof that university degrees of marginal utility can lead to a career. I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially the web audience. At some point, somebody's going to hold up a piece of paper that tells me how many people are. We have 40 people that are participating via the web streaming, and we'll probably have more as we go along. We're going to be talking about data today, and it's kind of interesting. We're talking about visualizing California philanthropy without using any visuals. And that was a decision made. You may have noticed as we were getting ready and warming up and having lunch here at the live audience, there were some images going by on the screen, which are essentially images which tell you a little bit about what in California philanthropy is. So I'm going to describe it to you and then introduce our panelists, and we're going to have a discussion about how very different kinds of foundations use data and understand data in their own work. But before, I just wanted to think a bit about what are the types of data that philanthropy needs. I wrote a piece on this a while back. It was in the Stanford Social Innovation Review blog. And I basically defined it as three types. Foundations need transactional data, they need contextual data, and they need impact data. Now, if we take those in reverse order, the one we hear about the most and we tend to beat ourselves up the most about is the impact data. We really want to know if we're being effective and if we're having impact. And I see virtual and real heads nodding about this because everyone knows how challenging and how difficult that can be. Partly because there's so many variables when you're working with social, environmental, and cultural issues. And I think we're going to figure out attribution sometimes when maybe we'd be best to settle for contribution, to know that we're contributing to having impact and success, even if we can't say it was only because of our intervention. But today I'm going to talk really more about the first two levels, which I think are absolutely essential and absolutely doable for philanthropy. But up until today, philanthropy has not done a very good job with them. And you really can't get at the impact and effectiveness if you can't master the transactional and the contextual data. So what do I mean by transactional data? Philanthropy, at least in this country, in the US, is basically about grant making. The vast majority in the United States are grant makers. Of the some 80,000 or so in the Foundation Center databases, only about 4,000 are actually operating foundations. So the vast majority of US foundations make grants. And one way to look at a grant is a transaction. Basically, a foundation is making a grant to a recipient. And that creates data. It creates data about the purpose of the grant, the amount of the grant, the duration of the grant, the geographic area served by the grant, the population, and maybe even the type of transaction. It may be for general support, which is what all nonprofits pray for every morning, general support. But it also might be for a capital campaign, which is probably the same they pray for. It could also be for advocacy work, capacity building. It could be for lots of different types of transactions. So all that creates a very rich data environment, which the Foundation Center has worked very hard to capture over the years. Now, we're living in a digital age, and capturing that information several decades ago meant actually manually reading through the tax returns of foundations, 990 PFs. And I don't know how many of you have actually had the pleasure of reading a 990 PF, but some of them are actually hundreds of pages long, and they have lots of attachments and lots of schedules. Some of them are still actually filled out in pencil, believe it or not. Some of them are filed digitally, but there are, every year, foundations produce 80 or 90,000 of these. And one has to go through these documents to understand details about the foundation and to look at the lists of grants that the foundations make and who they make them to. The Foundation Center has taken that information off the tax returns for years, put it originally into books. I think some of you probably remember those big cloth-covered books that were bigger than telephone books. Now it's all in online databases, Foundation Director Online, for example, which a lot are at the Foundation Center offices. But also, what is more recent is 1,000 foundations, and we actually have in our presence on the panel here the 1,000th foundation to actually electronically report their grant information to the Foundation Center. And why is it so important to electronic information? Foundations have up to a year after their fiscal year ends to file their 990. That goes to the Internal Revenue Service. And even if you file it digitally, it turns it into an image file called a TIFF file. Then organizations like the Foundation Center and GuideStar get monthly shipments of DVD-ROMs from the Internal Revenue Service with image files on them of these 990 tax returns, which then have to be turned into searchable PDFs. Pieces of them are optically scanned, and the rest of it is manually entered into databases to get at the transactional data I'm talking about today. All that means is that by the time that data is filed, by the time it gets from the IRS, it's processed, it's cleaned, all that kind of stuff, it's uploaded into databases, it could be 3 years have gone by. So we are essentially an industry that is operating on trend information that is as much as 3 years old. What electronic reporting does is it allows foundations to directly export their information from their grants management software to the Foundation Center via an Excel spreadsheet or some other format. And that gets into our databases as current year information, and there's some foundation that essentially sends that information to us in virtual real time almost daily. So this brings me to the project here, Visualizing California Philanthropy. This is the of a national campaign called Get on the Map. The Get on the Map campaign is the Foundation Center working together, as was said here earlier, with 20 regional associations of grant makers all across the country that are going to mobilize their foundation members to electronically report their information to the Foundation Center. Why is it called Get on the Map? Well, first of all, every foundation that electronically sends their information will get back their own information on an interactive GIS mapping platform, which they can use internally for their own purposes. They can use it on their websites. They can generate reports, explore their own grant making on an interactive, geographically located platform. It's also called Get on the Map because the regional associations that participate will get a map which can be used as a member benefit, which will show all the grants made by all of their members that electronically report information. So the members of each regional association will be able to see all the other members are funding. This is a very important thing in philanthropy because it's very difficult for an individual foundation to really know what another foundation is doing. Most of that is done through personal networks, incomplete. It's not necessarily real time. And there are many more foundations out there working on anything you can think of than you might ever imagine. The third reason it's called it's called Get on the Map and Visualizing California Philanthropy, is that in a later stage of the project, there will be a public-facing mapping platform of some type. We need to figure out exactly what it's going to look like, which will take all of the information that has been generated in this way on California philanthropy. And this will be the only state where we actually have a near real-time portrait of what the collective of California foundations are funding in California. We're going to be talking a bit today about what some of the benefits of that are. And just before I turn it over to the panelists, the second kind of data I mentioned, contextual data, the great thing about mapping platforms is that you can layer data on top of them. So it is possible to layer onto a map like this relevant demographic information about groups, about income, about schools, about crime statistics. Depending on what the interests of individual foundations and groups of foundations are, it's possible to essentially spin custom versions of these maps off that deal with specific issues. And the Foundation Center has been doing this. We're going to hear a little bit about some of that today, but has done it on areas like black male achievement in this country, water access, sanitation globally, and a number of other issues where we're able to layer this contextual information on top of the grants information so you can see the environment in which grants are being made and how indicators are changing or not. What we have today is fantastic because we have people who work for very different kinds of foundations and also represent sort of different functions within those foundations. I'm going to be essentially asking questions, and they'll be responding, and then we'll take questions from all of you and from the streaming audience. To my far right, which is merely her geographic location at the table, the Foundation Center is apolitical and it's not an advocacy group, so we do not label political tendencies. We have Pamela David, who is executive in Elise Haas Fund, a very well-known fund, certainly in San Francisco. And in many ways, a kind of technology leader, although Pam, I think, went to great lengths during our preparatory conversations to point out that she herself is not a digital native. We also have in the middle here Peter Long, who is the president and CEO of Blue Shield of California Foundation, that works on a number of extremely important social issues, one in which our two organizations have collaborated quite a bit is on domestic violence work, which is one of the most important kinds of things foundations can do. And then to my right next to me is the director of grants management at one of the nation's largest foundations, which is a national and global funder, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I'm particularly excited that we have someone who is an experienced grants manager, because I think, for many years in foundations, grants managers were basically people that just, sort of processed things on the way, a check popping out on the other end. But in an era where we're talking about grants data and visualizing, they are essentially information managers. And a lot of the information that comes in to foundations will increasingly be going through grants managers. And that role, I think one of the ways I like to look at it is that grant managers are finally, sort of achieving their proper recognition and role in the foundation universe in an era where information is so important. So the first question I want to ask all of you is just to talk a little bit about your own organizations and in terms of what your own efforts are like to be more and sharing information and sort of harnessing data and technology is part of that process. So Pam, do you want to start us off?
Sure, to your far right, not, but, when I think about how we're a, modest-sized family foundation, long-standing with a very local focus. We essentially fund in Alameda and San Francisco counties in the areas of education and American Jewish life, and then I get to do a lot of work around public-private partnerships, particularly around anti-poverty issues. Transparency is particularly interesting to me because before I came into philanthropy 12 years ago, I worked in local government for 12 years. And I find it I found it shocking, actually, how non-transparent philanthropy was, even though government has a reputation for being bureaucratic and not transparent. At least in San Francisco, I had to publish my calendar every week. Every single meeting had minutes that were public. Every single meeting was open to the public. It was rare that you could have, between the Brown Act and Sunshine Laws, there was incredible amount of transparency, appeals processes on appeals processes. And you come into philanthropy, and there is a veneer of openness and transparency, but so much of our work is actually behind the curtain. And this is the nature of the beast, particularly in family foundations. Families set up private foundations in order to be behind the scenes and have program officers and staff, executive directors be the voice and the front of the foundations, but at least in the old-fashioned way of doing things. Things may be changing with these new generations, but I still think there is no appeal process. We would never publish the minutes of our board meetings. So in terms of context, transparency is relative. Now, given that, it's always been very important to us that, in particular, prospective grantees have good information, because we do not want them to waste time in running after us and putting proposals together if, in fact, they don't fit. So, 12 years ago, when I came to the foundation, it was about having a good website that had clear guidelines on it and clarity around it. Now it's changing, and the issue for me now is wanting broader transparency of what we do and who we do it with, in order to have a bigger impact on what we do. We talk about collaboration, but we really haven't had the data that supports that collaboration. I'll stop there because I see Brad looking at me, but I think there is a lot to talk about.
Yeah, that's a really good point, the one about the collaboration, because obviously having more, better, and more real-time information about grants is immensely valuable to nonprofits, because it gives them a much better idea of what foundations are funding and where they can possibly get it. But for foundations themselves, one of the reasons it's difficult for foundations to collaborate, and they don't do more of it, is the transaction costs of collaboration are very high. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to actually know what another foundation is doing to figure out whether or not they might be your partner. Now, you may know some people in a personal network, but to scale in today's world, we need to go beyond our personal network. So, Peter, do you want to talk a bit about data in your organization and how you see it, and transparency and all that good stuff?
Sure. So I have just three comments I'd make here. One is a corporate foundation. I think you actually operate in a highly scrutinized, transparent world. So I think our default is to share information, and I would say we as the staff are stewards of the resources we've been given from the company, and our job is to demonstrate to the company, to our stakeholders, and to others that we're putting it to work. So I would say our default, we may not be perfect, but I would say the orientation of our organization is it's a corporate orientation. Things should be publicly available. It should be transparent and putting out. And I think that's something that just is an ethos, and we can always get better at that. But that just is the orientation. It's probably in contrast to family foundations. Second, I would say we had the kind of V8 moment, the epiphany. We work in domestic violence and on healthcare. And we had the epiphany of we can't do anything by ourselves. We're asking our grantees to do incredibly complex, transformative things, whether it's in the domestic violence field to kind of become a system of care as opposed to a safety net or a place of last resort, or in healthcare to implement effectively the Affordable Care Act. Those are really complicated, high risk, high reward things. For us, it's all built on trust, and so the trust is around transparency of what's effective and what's not, what we're going to fund, what we won't fund, what's our point of view. We're very clear that we're a foundation with a point of view, and one of our transparencies to say this is our point of view, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we're going to grant trust to you with the best ever core operating support. And in return, we're going to ask you to kind of go on this journey with us around transformation in the healthcare system. That being said, so that's kind of at a gestalt when I talk about aspirational. I'd say real, keeping it real. We struggle as an organization to use data effectively. I mean, so we actually have a lot of data that we ourselves struggle to put to work to actually have it drive, future decisions. And we're working on it, and we're really trying to improve. I would say we do a lot of if Pam's our board, how do we do, Pam? Here's our report. And then either she says great, and we all celebrate, or she says terrible, and we kind of get depressed. And then we take the paper and put it back and move on to the next thing. So I'd say we have a lot of work to do as an organization about how do we actually take all that data and use it effectively. And I imagine we're probably not alone if I surveyed the room, but that's the honest answer. Is aspirationally, I think we're in good shape, and operationally, I think we're still learning.
I want to turn to Sarah. Now, Sarah, you not too long ago have had a presidential transition at the Hewlett Foundation, and Larry Kramer came in, and Larry sort of came in with a radically, in some ways a radical view about transparency. He flipped the whole paradigm on transparency and said, as far as I'm concerned, everything should be transparent, and you need to come to me and make the case why X, Y, or Z should not be transparent, which is usually the opposite way it's done in foundations. I mean, basically, I think as Pam was describing, that things are not transparent and you sort of struggle to justify why something should be made more transparent. So what's that like for you?
Yeah. So he does call it radical transparency. And as he came in, just to speak for him a bit, his background is constitutional scholarship. So for him, it really is an ethical calling that the right thing for a democratic society is for foundations to be transparent, that we get the tax benefits, and our right and obligation then to society is to be transparent. So for him, it really, his leadership really sets a tone of, even if it's hard, it's the right thing to do. And even before Larry, the history of Hewlett was an ethos of transparency. But he really sort of dialed up the volume on that considerably as he came in, and did really put that out there, that the message is we should do anything. But it actually takes time, energy, and resources to do it well. Someone has to be curating the content in order to share it externally, whether that's a technologist to share data, or a systems person to have the system in place to do that, or someone who can write well to write something for an external audience. That just throwing things over the transom on our website does not really fit the obligation of transparency or the vision that we're trying to embody. And in it, when everyone's stretched very thin, it's easy to forget the external audience and to not have the time to then write the piece or create the feed or do whatever we need to do. So that, I think that's the intent is there within the organization, but I think our challenges tends to be around that question of who's going to curate and make the content usable for the right audiences out there.
I want to take this down a little bit more to sort of get on the map itself, this campaign to get the maximum number of California foundations to be sharing their grants data in as near real time as possible and having it visualized. And just ask the panelists a few questions about that. Peter had mentioned to me in his process of becoming the 1,000th foundation to electronically report information to the Foundation Center.
You can cheer for that.
Yeah, right. Ran into some sort of interesting issues on the way of doing that. I don't know if you want to share any of those. I mean, how easy or difficult was it? Did you just basically press a key in the computer and the grants magically flew away and landed in the Foundation Center? How did it go?
Well, it's very easy for me. I said we should do it, right? And then your job is done. That's, self-awareness. It's actually it was a more challenging reality of two things. One, the point I think that Sarah raised is, if you're just pushing for effectiveness and pushing for impact and pushing for impact, you don't sit down and do those things like this to map your, in your grant system, to map it to how do you actually upload it into what the Foundation Center wants. And then we ran into the problem of our vendor told us that they'd be happy to do it for us, our software vendor, for a charge, and it would take 3-week wait time, and it was going to be this customized report. Fortunately, our staff, who's industrious, said, well, I could do it myself. They told her she couldn't do it herself. And I'm like, that's an odd answer. But she said it took an hour and a half. So they had a whole conversation. She probably spent an hour and a half negotiating with the vendor, and then sat down and did an hour and a half, and I think it came out well. And she said so it's one of those things that it gets built up, first finding the time to do it. But when you actually sit down and map it, it was actually pretty straightforward. And I can confirm that SCG is having a similar set about their profiles, and they've in fact gone to pencil and paper and are inputting it because it's such an entry barrier for people just to sit down and do the mapping work to put it on. So it sounds like a very low barrier, but there's human nature of kind of just digging in and doing it.
Let's see. Pam, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe how if this data could be visualized on maps, all right? Let's say we had a map with hundreds of San Francisco grant makers on it.
Which there are, yes.
Yes, right. And you could visualize that and access it and search it by subject, by type of organization, by location, by neighborhood, all that kind of stuff. How might you use it in your work, and how do you think your staff might use it? Or would they use it?
I'll be very honest, I think the mapping function for us is probably not quite as important as the real-time data. Mm-hmm. That is what, when I think about how we might use this, I think about the 3 billion education funders in the Bay Area, and how each of us has to have our own strategy and goals and then set of grantees, but in fact there's a finite number of grantees. And the issue to me in terms of being able, mapping is a piece of it, but the real-time data saying who else is actually funding these organizations, for what reasons, and do we have an obligation as funders to talk amongst each other and figure out if this organization is important to each of us, are we in fact resourcing them in the right way? Are we making them jump through a billion hoops unnecessarily for each of us that they don't have to? So what I would hope that it could do is kind of unclutter the individual siloed funding streams of each foundation and create a more cohesive and thoughtful funding strategy for the work that we all want to get done within a certain area, within a certain set of grantees.
Pam, today, how do you and your staff go about understanding who else is supporting an organization that you're supporting?
I think there's a couple of different ways. One is you look at when you get a proposal and you look at a budget, and you see on the budget who else is funding that other organization. And there's always the due diligence of you're talking to you looking at that and you're talking to colleagues. There's also the kind of local versions of affinity groups. So you pretty much know who else is in your arena. But we do not, we demand collaboration from grantees, but we really don't operate in that manner. And the data is only useful if we use it in a way to cut through some of that.
Yeah. And I think this is, perhaps an interesting role for some of the regional associations too, like San Diego grant makers and Southern California grant makers and Northern California grant makers to actually help use that data together, but use the convening power to pull together funders and say, look, this is what we're seeing in the data. Let's have a conversation about how we're approaching these organizations and these issues, et cetera. So Sarah, tell me a little bit about, do you think that providing this information in sort of, getting it from the program officers, processing it and, exporting it out is, what kind of hiccups along the way do you see, or do you see it changing roles? Do you think the program officers are going to just say, great, I'll get it, get it for you
Right
as
there.
fast as you
Yeah.
as you need it.
So we fortunately have already crossed that hurdle a bit in that we have a real-time data feed set up that as soon as we receive a signed grant agreement letter from a grantee and it's uploaded in the system, that night the grant shows up on our website as having been awarded, and there's a feed that can be scraped
Yeah.
for that. So we're
Yeah.
very fortunate that we've sort of already gotten there. What we have recently been doing is adding to what goes out onto our website and through the feed. The most recent thing, and probably the more controversial hurdle internally, was to have the full paragraph that we give to the board about each grant be also put on our website. And for some program
Okay.
officers, that was a challenging moment. Why was it challenging? Because of the feeling of it being two different audiences. And if you're writing for the board, you're writing perhaps differently than for an external audience. But I think with Larry's leadership and the senior staff really interrogating how much of that is true and how much of that is a felt sense that it's two separate audiences. And in some cases, it actually is the case that we don't want to say something about a nonprofit that would be controversial or hard for them to have on our website. So we will allow editing in those cases, but not beyond that. And the only other thing I would sort of add on to that is sort of a reflection just about technology and technology in general, which is my experience has been that technology can actually drive culture and behavior change. So the example I would use is an internal example. So in 2010, 2011, Hewlett moved from a paper grants management system to an all paperless system like many other foundations. And in the design of that system, which most of it happened before me, so I can't take credit for that, but it was made to be fully transparent internally. So which meant that rather than there being a paper file on one person's desk who could know everything about that grant, anybody anywhere in the building or outside the building could look up any grant at any time, all through our history. So suddenly, the culture of the organization actually shifted to that. We didn't talk about it as a culture change, but suddenly the legal department, the finance department, grants management, all programs could look up any grant and any other program, and there was full transparency internally, and it actually changed the way the foundation works internally. And things like, who's giving to this university, since many of our program officers are all giving to the same organizations, who's giving to them? That was like easy to find. The sense of self-service, of being able to look up information in real time changed. So even though a California-specific map may not meet the needs of a lot of what Hewlett does, we're a global funder, and so a lot of our funding isn't in the state of California, the reason I feel really committed to it is because I've observed that over time, if data and information is available, there are sort of unforeseen and positive consequences to how people think and behave when they have more information in real time and available to them. So that would be my reflection on sort of just the role technology can play.
I'm going to turn to Peter, but just before that, I just want to clarify one thing that Sarah's talking about is the, publishing on their website and having it read. There's Hewlett publishes its grants in a format. Technically, it's called a micro format called HGrant, which means that it is machine readable. So it goes on their website, and basically any other computer can grab it. The Foundation Center grabs it and actually pulls it into a feed that represents the grants by about 20 of some of the largest foundations. It's a project they got involved in called the Reporting Commitment, where they're streaming their data as machine readable open data through the Foundation Center. Also want to bring it that Pam's foundation has developed a very interesting HGrant plugin for WordPress. A lot of foundations use WordPress as a content management system, as a web platform. And this essentially is a plugin that allows you to publish your grants onto your data, onto your website in a machine readable format. And I think there's 3 or 4 foundations now which have started to use that. And it's particularly important because, Hewlett can sort of do a lot of this because Hewlett is a big, really well-resourced foundation with its own IT department, a crackerjack IT department. But smaller foundations don't have IT departments. They're lucky if they have an IT person or somebody really techie. So this ability to plug in something that allows you to do what the big foundations are doing is a real game changer.
I just want to comment on the 2 cultural shifts that are probably not immediately apparent on using the data, but I think Sarah mentioned them. But just for us, I think they are front and center. One is single use of data. So you don't have one set of data that you prepare for your board and then another for something else. So really getting into a mindset of your write-up is both to get it approved by the board, it is a record of your conversation with the grantee, it is what you'd want to share with the world. And so thinking rather than, we did a rapid process improvement, and it was astronomical. I think we had 120 handoffs, 400 steps in our grant making process, 123 handoffs, and the value add maybe 0.0001% in terms of truly, like, did it make a difference? But this concept of using the map and entering data electronically and making it publicly available just changes your entire mindset to a single use, and it's the same set of information repurposed, but you're not creating multiple streams. I think if we all looked at organizations, how much of our energy goes to a separate stream of information and work for separate audiences. And then the second is the moment of, wait a second, everybody else is now using our data and actually deriving a lot of value. Why aren't we using it? Why aren't we doing it ourselves? And why aren't we sitting down and getting smarter ourselves about the grants we're making, or the grants that Pam's making, or that Sarah's making, and things. So I think those are just two cultural shifts in this process that might not show up in the map, but you begin to step back because your reality becomes so disconsonant with this other work that you're doing, you have to step back and reevaluate and say, wait a second, we need to rethink it. So I just want to call those, I think technology, as Sarah put it well, so technology driving cultural shifts within our organizations.
I want to just pose one more question to the panel, and then we'll open it up. So let's say we're successful beyond our wildest dreams, and we have, almost every California foundation has electronically reported contributed its information through the Gun the Map campaign, and we actually have a map of all of California philanthropy. California is sort of the social laboratory of the future in many ways. It's an extremely diverse state. It's a state with lots and lots of political cross currents in it. Lots of really challenging environmental issues, and a very strong sense of activism and public accountability. So I'd just like the panelists to reflect a little bit about, why is it important, and what will we be able to do with a visualization that actually allows us to see the totality of California philanthropy?
I'd say a couple things. First off, I think if we had a map, it would, in fact, verify a lot of the groundwork that Irvine Foundation has done, which has talked about the overconcentration of philanthropy on the coast and the lack of philanthropic support for folks in the middle of California, from top to bottom. So I think there's, while we are philanthropically rich as a state, there is tremendous imbalances across the state. And if we looked at that at a constituency level and at an issue level, I think we would also find great imbalances. So I think that would be very helpful. And the second thing I was going to say, I've now forgotten. But I'm sure it was really, really important.
So here, I think Pam was going to say this.
Right.
So Pam's
well-prepped.
Pam's utopian vision. No, but I actually think that what I'm most excited about is the stage 3, to make the information readily available. If you put context in our transactional information, one of my biggest frustrations with philanthropy is that we are a narrow set of institutions, or people in institutions talking to other institutions, being nonprofits. And I think in the 21st century, the solutions are going to come outside of institutions. And so to me, it's the power of, hey, we got this far. We actually worked on, whether it's domestic violence or poverty or education, making that available to entrepreneurs, to young people, to others who are outside of our kind of ecosystem, and letting them come up with new solutions. To me, that is when we'll have success. And I'm not guaranteeing, I don't know what they're going to look like, but when we can get to that point of, we got this far, this worked, this didn't, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, now, and we don't need just codathons to do it. People in real time can kind of have all of our information as a starting point, apply their own lens, apply their own culture, apply their own kind of whatever it is, community solutions. That to me that's the power of this.
I do remember what I was going to say.
Wasn't what Pam was going to say.
And it wasn't. What Peter said is really important, and this is it's almost a variation on the theme. I think having that data out there, in fact, will increase the external pressure on philanthropy for transparency. I also think it'll increase the pressure for regulation, not necessarily what we saw a few years ago, which was a very limited slice of the pie with SB, what was it, 672? Yeah, that one. But more generally, in terms of if in fact philanthropy is supposed to, in return for example, with family foundations for large tax breaks, supposed to meet the common good or for common benefit, who gets to define that and how is that used? And I also think it'll call more attention to what's the use of the corpus versus the use of the grant making. So. I think it's an important piece, and it's one we should absolutely expect, and from my perspective, welcome.
That's great. I love both those visions. For me, I think there's a way that real-time data can really transform the way we might be thinking because we would have the data available readily. There's a way where philanthropy is kind of slow and methodical and analytical because we take our role so seriously, which is a good thing. We're stewarding resources. We want to do it well. There's like this tone of perfectionism in our field. So the ability to adapt quickly, learn, fail, and pivot is not something that we're that comfortable with. But real-time data really puts it right in your face in a different way than we've had before. So for me, a utopia in terms of the culture of the sector would be that real-time data becomes something that drives a more adaptive, creative, innovative, and fluid way of thinking about our work, and a little bit less we build logic models and stick with them and then learn 3 or 4 years later if they're working and then write a white paper about it and that kind of way. And I understand where that all comes from. It's we want to do our work well, so we take it really seriously. But having worked in other aspects of the civil society, I still feel like philanthropy can be quite stodgy and slow. And data and technology can break that down much more quickly than human beings can.
You know, Pam's comment was really quite interesting because it reminded me about the creation of the Foundation Center. And this issue about if you put out a lot of information, will it provoke regulation, is a very old debate in this field. And it's so old that actually it gave birth to the Foundation Center. Because it was in the 1950s during McCarthyism when there were 2 sets of congressional hearings on the activities of foundations, alleging that foundations were supporting un-American activities. These were the Cox Commission hearings and the Reese Commission hearings. And it was actually John Gardner, who was at the time the head of the Carnegie Foundation, convened a meeting of foundation leaders. And he said, look, unless we develop a public information service about philanthropy, we're going to continually be subject to this kind of suspicion, especially during times of political conflict or economic pressure. If we're not going to tell people what we do, then people are going to invent all these ideas about what we really are doing. So now there's no ultimate way to prove either one of those hypotheses, but the other thing I think that's really important about what we're talking about today is that philanthropy does not exist in a bubble. It exists in real time in a world that probably California exemplifies more than anywhere else, where digital information is flowing through us and around us, and it's simply never been easier, faster, or cheaper to get information and misinformation about virtually anybody and anything. So it's not as if philanthropy or the social sector sort of had the luxury of sitting this one out, because as we're here, I know perfectly well there's people Googling these 3 foundations, and they're looking through their Twitter feeds, and they're trying to get some idea of what they're doing and what they care about, and could I get a grant, and maybe there's an investigative reporter that got a lead on something. And so one of the things we try to talk to foundations about is that to be proactive about this and to really tell your own story and shape your own information in today's world is incredibly important, because people are looking for that information. So we're going to open it up to the audience here. and to our virtual audience. Are we using microphones so people can hear? Okay. We have some very low-tech things we're using here. I'll repeat the questions. All right. Okay. So we have a question here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start. Thank you so much. This is great. I think what I've been wondering is, as I'm going to imagine there are perhaps a few skeptics in the room about this approach, given that we've all shown up. So tell me what your understanding is of perhaps the mental models or a fear of unintended consequences or cultural, you can think of it any way you want, sort of describe it any way you like, that are making this something other than a no-brainer in our field.
Okay.
What's holding us back?
I'm going to paraphrase the questions
You could even say it better
for the audience. And this is basically a question that says, look, there's obviously skeptics, so convince us. What do we envision are the obstacles and the cultural issues in our own organizations that might make us more difficult, and why is this so important?
And how might we approach that?
And what kind of arguments can we use to sort of overcome the natural skeptics? Any volunteers up here?
Well, I was thinking about what it was interesting for me to hear Sarah talk about how they feel stretched, because you always think of Hewlett as having all the resources in the world. We feel stretched.
The Gates Foundation frequently says they're understaffed, so.
Right. And in fact, that which really ties into one of the fears, that the more we open ourselves up, the more folks will want a piece of us, and I don't mean it in terms of just money, but in terms of time. And we are very leanly staffed, and that has been a real concern of some of my program officers who already feel like they have way more in a day than they can get to. And we believe in being very responsive and being accessible, but will the flood doors open?
So I would say this is not if you're an and one, or if you're doing this as like dessert or something else and it's another piece of work that you've converted. I think the way that at least that we're thinking about as a foundation to address that issue, address both the issues, the one that Brad raised about if you don't tell your story, someone else is going to tell it for you, and they're probably not going to tell it as well as you'd like to tell it and in the way you tell it. But this is a great opportunity to rethink and streamline some of your systems. And to me, it's the ultimate mirror. So it isn't about the mapping. I get that they're skeptics, but this is holding the ultimate mirror to yourself. And like we did, you have 423 touches and 123 handoffs in your grant making process. Well, you're never going to be able to do the map it if that's how you construct, if you just add that onto it. So to me, I think for the skeptics, look at your own process and how do you feel about them? And do you want to tell your own story, or do you want someone else to tell it? And do you want your foundation to be a hole in the map? Because there'll be others, and what will happen is, wait a second, I thought Haas was funding in that area. They're not on but they're not on this map. And people will again infer what's going on there and what's happening. So I just think it's this is a mirror into your organization and what you want it to be. Mm-hmm. And my sense would be embrace it and take advantage. I mean, that's our approach to things.
I think what Sarah said was really interesting about, when they sort of made all their grants information available to everyone and they can access it, remotely and all that kind of stuff. I talked to somebody, I was at Hewlett yesterday, and talked to somebody who's been there just came recently. And this is the system they walked into or using. I think it's great. So we have to keep remembering this, that we have new generations coming to organizations for which this is just the way things are done. And they're not really burdened with the way things used to be done. I remember years ago at the Ford Foundation, I still remember, it was 1996, a grants administrator came to me and said, why do we have footnotes on grant recommendations? Okay, and there were footnotes on the grant recommendations. The grant recommendations were about 30 pages long, and they had to footnote things, and the New York Times style guide was used for the punctuation on the footnotes, and the footnotes would actually be, the grant recommendations would be sent back if the punctuation wasn't correct in the footnotes. So I thought, great idea, I was new, so I said, look, let's eliminate them. And the great footnote war of 1996 erupted, and in which there were passionate email pleas about the historical record. And what I learned from that is that every process in an organization has a constituency. It was people decided to do something. I mean, the process that Peter was talking about was not created for the purpose of being bureaucratic. It was created incrementally by people trying to solve problems. This kind of shift will be another shift that, new generations of staff coming in will just see, oh, great, this is the way it's done here. How great we have this information. I think something that's something hard for us to envision, especially those of us who are caught up in the change. We have another question over here? I think, yeah.
Yeah, that was me, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I did not anticipate based on the title, that we would be talking about transparency and the future of the field related to this. And I think it's wonderful with respect to, I think in our own organization at Blue Shield of California Foundation, the generational shift in our, when you see the folks who, they are ready to just share what they're thinking. And I will put myself in the camp of, let's be a little bit more analytical.
Wait a minute, yeah.
So it is a little bit of that shift. My question, though, was something you said earlier, Brad, about the power of this data as it relates to layering with other data. And I was hoping maybe you could speak to more about that.
Yeah. I just give you an interesting example we worked on. It was actually, the original idea came from a California foundation, which is the Conrad Hilton Foundation, which is one of the largest and longest supporters of access to safe water around the world. 900 million people in the world do not have drinkable water or safe water. It's a very serious problem, and they're one of the leaders, actually, in that area. And they came to say, look, we know we know the partners we know about. We know the Gates funds in this, and Rockefeller funds a little bit and whatnot. And we would like to create a working group of the foundations that we know about working in this area and sit down and said, could we develop a web portal that would show us all the grants that are being made in this area by all the foundations that are making them, not just the ones we know about, that would show us for each country around the world relevant indicators that relate to sanitation, hygiene, and water access. Different grading systems that exist out there to actually grade the quality of water in countries. And also, we know that foundations, we're not the biggest funders in this game. Actually, the big foreign aid programs in the World Bank are. So could you also show us what our funding looks like in relation to big government spending around the world? So this resulted in something called washfunders.org. It's a public-facing site, and you can see it. It has a mapping platform sitting in the middle of it, which shows country by country around the world foundation spending in relation to governmental spending for water access, sanitation, hygiene, and can be searchable by strategies. So you can actually see how much is being spent on river systems, how much is spent on advocacy, how much is being spent on education, and the mix of resources together with all these other indicators about water quality. There's all sorts of other information in there too. But the mapping platform itself, maps are interfaces for data, and you can just layer data sets on them to show what people need to know. So I think the best way to do it is usually around issues that people care about. So you put the relevant data, because with computer and storage capacity the way it is today, you could layer like every possible data set in the world and something. You end up with something so complicated nobody can figure out how to use it. So.
And this is why I think it's great to have NCG, the partners, the regional, because I think that's where you put together this as the foundation. Then you layer on interest groups or folks that are naturally coming together. But the key is this is the wallpaper in the back that supports it. And I think it'd be powerful to add our regional association. So I think it's really important that this isn't just a Hewlett initiative funding it or an Irvine funding it. It's through the regional association. I think that's where the power and the add-ons will happen. Not speaking for Ellen, but I think that's the question.
Okay, do we have any other questions from our virtual audience?
Questions that have come in addressing sort of the burden on the grantees when it considers the collection of some of this data and how some of you are mitigating some of that challenge from sort of streamlining additional data, but then asking in some ways your grantees to be the collectors and the sharers.
Yeah, I'll just say, before throwing it to the panelists, actually for what we're planning to capture on the Get on the Map campaign, there's actually no burden to the recipient organizations, because the source of the information that will go onto the map is actually the foundations. So it will include the recipient and some information about the recipient, which is already available. It will include a little bit of information about the foundation, which is already available. And it will include essentially the transaction, which is how much the grant was for, what the description of the grant, and some additional information which will be provided by the foundation or by the foundation center around things like the population served by the grant, the geographic area served by the grant, maybe the type of support. These are the different ways you can filter the information. But at least for this particular campaign, there's no direct burden envisioned on nonprofits, which is a good thing. I think that might be a larger question just about general foundation operating procedures and how much foundations are starting, in the name of impact and effectiveness and evaluation, are outsourcing a lot of this by putting data requests and information needs on nonprofits. So maybe somebody wants to address that.
Yeah, I think that question probably comes more from the third type of data Brad talked about earlier, impact data, which we do have issues, I think, as a sector, and where we're putting the responsibility for the hard work of having quality impact data. But transactional data, my observation, and I may be speaking from only a large foundation perspective, is it's all data that we would want internally anyway about our grant making for our board or for other audiences, and we're just using it for another purpose.
One thing that's interesting, though, it does feel like whether it's the data entry or the asking people to do your own profile of your foundation, and it feels like we've had a lot of conversation about shared application that doesn't go anywhere. This might be a way that you actually, look, we're already standardized now. Like, we are sharing, we're all on the map. We have, our units are actually so much more overlapping. We already are, we just have a really poor interface. We actually all do have the same application, just with a crappy interface that we put out to our grantees, because we're actually collecting the same information. So this might be a way, because it feels like foundation, we really bristle at things that are front branded, and we're giving those up. One of the byproducts may be that we just say, look, we already are standardizing our information that we're sharing with one another. Why don't we have it? Why don't we just do the application? And it won't be from a place of, let's have a work group where we all have a standard application and things. It's just, that's one, to me, I've been struck by how long it takes us to agree on that.
Anything else from cyberspace?
Yeah, there's definitely quite a few more questions coming in from cyberspace. I think, so another question that's sort of coming up is around how we can start this cultural shift within an organization. So some people are sort of asking, they're at the beginning stage of this. Where do you think the catalyst is to become more transparent? Is it from leadership?
Okay, this is a question about the transparency journey. So within an organization, where does it start and who starts it? Does it start with Larry Kramer coming in and say we're going to do radical transparency? Does it start somewhere down in the engine room, with a visionary grants administrator?
I think so.
So
Yeah.
all of the above. So maybe people could talk a little bit about their own organizations and sort of where the impetus comes from.
I think the answer is it can come from a lot of different places. In our situation, I would say we made some moves towards transparency starting 10 years ago when we, instead of just listing who we fund and the amount, we actually had a paragraph about why we funded them and how it fit into our guidelines. That was a big shift for us. But then this last transformation was driven by our new director of administrations who came out of NCG, who I stole from NCG, really, sorry, and who'd been part of a national work group looking at some of these transparency and reporting issues. And she's the one who developed the plug-in for the H-grant reporting for organizations of our size about how you integrate it into the way into the software you were already using to publish to the web, so that we also do have real-time reporting to the Foundation Center, though we usually own meetings. There's not much in between. But so, and she's really driven the change in our organization as a, position in which she wears lots of different hats in a 10-person organization. And that's the next iteration.
So one of the observations I've had is that I think the historical roots of the philanthropic sector, it makes sense, are that program has been sort of the predominant place where energy has gone in the past. So program staff, program strategy, all things program, and this is going to sound very biased since I don't work on the program side at Hewlett, but I think we are in the middle of a transformation, and this is part of the shift where we understand the value of the other roles in the organization in a new and different way. I'm on a personal campaign to ban the use of the phrase back office to describe certain roles within philanthropy, that we're all front office, we're all doing roles that are about impact and strategy and achieving good in the world, and we're all doing it in different ways. And so I think a big part of the culture shift that I've seen in different organizations, and I've seen foundations that sort of all along this spectrum, is having the right people in the right roles in the room at the right times. So often what I've seen in foundations get stuck in is a pattern where program staff are working in a silo independently, coming up with their vision, their strategy, where they're headed, bake it pretty far along, and then bring in the operational people to have a conversation about how to execute. And at that point, they're pretty married to what they've decided. Have already sort of gotten far enough along and not asked certain key questions about systems, data, operations, and execution. And many program staff are good at those things, but not all program staff are really good at the operational implementation, data, and system stuff. So to have the people in the room who are really skilled at that earlier on, I think does drive a different conversation, and it allows those people to influence what's going to happen early enough that they actually can have that conversation and not have it be at the end where it's just, can we make this grant or not? Being in a role where you're just either vetoing grants or sending out grant agreement letters is no fun. So to be in a conversation where you're actually influencing, well, we'd have to track data differently to be able to strategy is going to work. We'd have to have a system that works differently, to think differently and be in the conversation there. I mean, that's why I came into the role that I'm in. I think a lot of people in the sector want to have those conversations, but philanthropy hasn't really broken down the silos to make it possible. So I'm on a personal campaign to say no more back office.
Something else that also will, transparency requires that you have your information in order so you can actually answer, succinctly, sort of reasonable questions that are asked of you as institutions are supposed to serve the public good. And I know philanthropy, some of the simplest questions as an industry, philanthropy has a lot of trouble answering. Like a simple question like, how much general support do foundations give? Sounds simple, right? How much general support? Well, we have somebody at the Foundation Center whose job is to look for patterns in data. So she went through 160,000 grants and found 261 different unique variations on the term general support. So, it can be core support, basic support, general support. I mean, there's 261, and you have to realize when you're pouring massive amounts of data through computers, a small word differential is identified as a separate thing. So, we had to basically build, come up with some code that would automatically convert all of those 261 variations into basic support. So, we live in a culture, I think it's asking questions, so those come from watchdogs. This may sound crazy. I think one of the things that's going to force philanthropy more into this game is Google. We are all expect basically to get the answer to most of our questions by going to a white screen with an empty box in it and typing in a phrase and having it usually spit out the results before we can even finish typing the phrase. Mm-hmm. And people expect to get information this way. And when you serve the public good and people ask reasonable questions of you, like how much general support do you give, or how much are you doing for X, or how much are you doing for Y, you can't sort of say, well, look, let me hire a consultant and I'll do a mapping exercise and I'll get back to you in 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question out here.
Yeah, we've got some other questions. Are there any questions in the room? Okay. So You know, how do we envision sort of a shared space or for collecting and sort of making meaning of this information, potentially even maybe a shared vocabulary for impact and the data behind it. So wondering, you know, what some of our visions are on the panel for that.
Yes.
Okay, so Suki Khan, who actually is the person we've been talking about, who developed the HGrant plugin for WordPress, is virtually present and has asked a question about, well, how do we actually create shared spaces to begin to sort of go to the next phase of this? You know, how do we develop sort of a common shared vocabulary around things like impact, for example, so that we can actually begin to talk, you know, in some ways, what can having this information available do to help spur the field towards having a common language where it talks about what it does? So, Peter, maybe?
Again, I would come back to the regional associations. I think that's the value add. And to me, the mapping is really what brings you to the table. But there actually has to be a table of, Google is not going to answer the question of how to solve poverty in San Francisco or social inequality or racial tension.
Let me try.
It may answer. I don't want Google's answer. No offense to Google, but I actually don't want the answer in that way. So to me, it really is and I also think the other thing, Brad's experience and you know, just our own experience, when you actually lay things end to end, and there are 261 definitions of core operating support, general support, we can look at each other and say, either we're going to enter into a relationship with one another, and in a relationship, you actually have to be able to speak to one another, and we're actually going to, you know, collaborate in that way. And so I do think that will lead to some conversations around how much standardization would be helpful for all of us. How much are we willing to give up some of our own idiosyncrasies, make our own language more transparent and simple for one another, but also for the people we're serving. And I think that's just a real conversation about how do we collaborate with each other. Because I think this brings us to the table with a running start toward collaboration. Having a map doesn't collaborate, right? Mm-hmm. The map is not collaboration in itself. It's like the app is not going to make you walk more steps. The app's going to tell you how many steps you walk and then give you that feedback. So to me, there's a central role of convening organizations. And then there is a central question of, I think it's Packard has the stages of collaboration all the way from co-funding to we talk to each other. I think that's, you know, that this will at least push us into those conversations.
I think there's a role for regional associations and of the, you know, all the affinity groups, grant makers in education, grant makers in the arts, National Asset Funders Network, goes on and on and on and on, because some of it is going to be, to some extent, issue specific. But the real thing is whether having data is going to be enough to drive fundamental behavior change at a foundation level. So I get and see how it can happen within an organization, whether it happens across organizations, and whether foundations give up some of their idiosyncratic individuality to actually work together in a different way. That's the test. I would hope to see it in my lifetime, but I don't think it'll be quick, even though we may get driven. The questions may be coming at us, but I think our behavior change will be slower.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think it's at the regional level and the field level where I see this already taking root to some extent, and things like Get on the Map are just going to sort of propel it further and have more opportunity. But to Peter's point, really basic stuff, or at least I think of it as basic, like when we're collaborating with other foundations, are we going to require grantees to complete several different application types, exactly, or are we going to accept one for the collaborative? And those kinds of basic operational questions end up being quite challenging. And you know, at Hewlett, we've sort of set a philosophy that we will take anybody else's application and nobody has to do ours. But that is a choice, and it actually has resource implications to make that choice.
And universities did it 15 years, 20 years ago with applications. So
yeah.
It's doable.
It's totally doable. So it's that the question of having those field level, and it is at the personal level. It's one PO to another PO to another PO where I see that happening. I think the more we can do to create that fertile ground where grants managers aren't creating policy.
But what it does is it gets us a running start on seeing ourselves as a field, we talk about ourselves as a field all the time, but the analogy I use for the field of philanthropy is the philanthropy is a field like Indonesia is a nation. Indonesia is a nation of 16,000 islands. Philanthropy is a field of, I don't know, it's 80,000 or 90,000 islands. But when you put things on a map and you visualize them and you see them all together, and you begin to look at these patterns of who's funding what where, what's being funded on the coast, what's being funded in rural areas, which organization, you begin to see this as an ecosystem. And the one thing I've learned in this job, I worked in big staffed foundations. I've really learned the incredibly important role of small, local, and regional funders. And they're an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. And for virtually any issue you can identify, you can see that in a visualization tool in a way that you couldn't see it any other way. So it begins to show you what the ecosystem is, because we are an ecosystem. And I really think that's the strength of philanthropy, that there are lots of different kinds of foundations with lots of different interests, lots of strategies, and lots of different comparative strengths. Davis, I think there's another question we have time for.
More questions, all focusing sort of on the grantee side of this. So how have your grantees reacted and sort of responded to your shift towards more transparency around the grants that you're making?
Okay. So the question is, how have the grantees responded to this shift to more transparency about the grants you're making to them?
I'll reflect on I talked earlier about the publishing grant paragraphs on our website. So internally, we had a lot of hand-wringing about how are our grantees going to feel about this? Was this going to be hard for them? And we had, you can imagine, many meetings. So we did a whole communication strategy where for the first docket where we were going to do this, we actually communicated proactively, shared the paragraph, gave grantees an opportunity to edit it. And we were expecting this to be a big workload, and in fact, it was nothing. It was like, tiny, no ripple at all. Nobody cared. It was not that big of a deal. We published them, we moved on, and now we do that at every docket.
So it wasn't like eliminating footnotes.
No, it wasn't. There was no 1996 war. And so I think, and I've seen it go the reverse. I've also seen times where we thought something wouldn't be a big deal, and it was. But in this case, I think the sense of it's not that big of a deal to just say more about what we do is what we took away from it.
And I would say as an add-on, are they being brought into the process as well?
Okay, so the add-on to that question is, are the grantees being brought into this process of being more transparent?
So it's interesting, this is a case of where you start something and then you realize the rest of your practice is not as aligned as it should be. So we started by having the principle that beneficiaries, like the actual beneficiaries of our grantees, so in our case, healthcare patients, domestic violence survivors, need to be part of the conversation. And I think that and we've always had advisory committees, but I think it's made us much more intentional about that. Just like we're asking our beneficiaries to co-design our work with us, we've got to have our grantees co-designing the work and thinking it through. So I would say, kind of thinking through if you change something in one place, you realize how out of whack or you're not up to speed on the other parts of it. Mm-hmm. So we're getting better on this one. We've always done the CEP and published our results, mm-hmm. but now we're actually asking our grantees, so what do you think this means about us? Not, what do we think it means about us? And what should we actually change in testing it? So we're moving in that direction just to be consistent with our own values.
I think we have one final question coming from the...
It's actually a very good closing question.
Oh, excellent.
So this is for everyone. What is one immediate call to action you have for the audience?
Okay, here's a facilitator type question coming from the cyber audience. What is one immediate call to action you have for the audience?
From the panelists.
So each panelist, this is like the lightning round.
Share your data. Get your data. That's the obvious, right? First, we do have to have the platform. We got to share your information, put it on this platform, and then the question is what we do with it.
Self-reflect. So after you've shared your data, use it to reflect upon, from a kind of generous learning stance, what could we do differently and better?
For me, it would be to value the operational side of philanthropy and to eliminate any double standard where I think we tend to think our grantees need to execute well and be operationally savvy and have the technology to do it. Make sure we're also doing that within our own sector.
Yeah. I think for foundations, I think what I would say is that I absolutely guarantee you that once this information is shared and visible, you will discover many more funders funding the same priority areas that you're funding. It will be much larger than the networks you think you know. Since I sense there's some nonprofits in the audience as well. I think with nonprofits, the one thing I think you can do to really help all of us and help foundations is to ask foundations questions. Ask them about, what they know about who's funding what where, and what they know about, how much general support has been given in California and how much of this, because, the questions are really what focus the mind and give us all a really good idea of what information ultimately would be useful. I think we're at time, so I want to thank everyone who's virtually with us, and I want to thank everyone who came today to the room, and especially thank our panelists, and we're launched.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.